There are some moments in history that are remembered because armies marched. Others are remembered because kings died. And then there are moments that history records almost casually, even though, for the person living through them, they must have felt enormous. A girl wakes before sunrise. Someone tells her to dress. Someone else brushes her hair. A servant brings a gown that is too formal for an ordinary morning. Adults speak in low voices. Doors open and close. Candles burn. And slowly, the girl begins to understand that something has been decided about her life. She is 12 years old, and today, she is going to be married. Not because she has fallen in love. Not because she has chosen someone. Not because she has imagined a future with another person. She is being married because kingdoms need alliances. Because families need protection. Because land needs heirs. Because kings and nobles have always found ways to turn private lives into political arrangements. Her name is Isabella, and by the end of this story, she will wear a crown. But tonight, we will not begin with the crown. We will begin with the girl, because before she became a queen, Isabella was simply a child trying to understand why the adults around her had suddenly become so serious. So, for a while, let us leave the modern world behind. Imagine a medieval kingdom somewhere in Western Europe. The century is the late Middle Ages. Stone castles rise above green valleys. Church bells divide the hours. Horses carry messages between towns. Candles provide the light after sunset. Roads are muddy. Winters are long. And information travels slowly, except when it concerns gossip. Then, somehow, it travels remarkably well. Tonight the kingdom is quiet. A thin mist rests over the fields. The castle walls are dark against the night sky. Inside, servants are preparing for an important ceremony. And in a small chamber at the eastern end of the castle, a 12-year-old girl is awake. She is not sleeping. She is staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, she will become a wife. She does not yet know what that means. The castle on the hill. Isabella was born in a castle that stood above a broad river valley. It was not the largest castle in the kingdom, but it was old. Its oldest walls had been built generations before she was born. The stones were uneven. The windows were narrow. In winter, cold air found its way through every crack. In summer, the courtyard filled with sunlight and the smell of horses. The castle was both home and fortress. People lived there. People worked there. People argued there. People prayed there. And people waited there. Waiting was a surprisingly large part of medieval life. Waiting for letters. Waiting for travelers. Waiting for harvests. Waiting for soldiers. Waiting for a king to make a decision. Waiting for winter to end. Isabella learned to wait very young. She was the second daughter of Duke Robert and Lady Anne. Her older brother, Henry was the heir. Her older sister, Margaret, was considered the beautiful one. Isabella was somewhere in between. She was not ignored completely, but she was rarely the center of attention. She had a quiet nature. She preferred books to parties, gardens to hunting, listening to conversation rather than joining it. Her mother sometimes worried about this. "A princess must be graceful," Lady Anne would say. "I am trying. You must also be confident. I am trying. And you must learn to speak when necessary." Isabella would nod. Then her mother would smile, and perhaps learn to speak a little less when unnecessary. Isabella understood the lesson. Court life rewarded people who knew when silence was valuable. A childhood of small things. Isabella's childhood was not entirely unhappy. It was simply different from the childhood modern people might imagine. She played with wooden dolls. She walked in the gardens. She watched falcons being trained. She learned embroidery. She learned prayers. She learned some Latin. She learned to ride a horse, although her mother preferred her to remain safely inside the castle. She also learned the complicated rituals of noble life. How to greet someone more powerful. How to bow. How to stand. How to sit. How to accept a gift. How to refuse one politely. How to recognize the difference between a genuine compliment and a political one. The last lesson took longer. Her father was often away. He traveled to the royal court. He attended councils. He negotiated with neighboring lords. Sometimes he returned after weeks away. When he came home, Isabella would wait near the great hall. She loved those moments. Her father always seemed larger when he returned. He brought stories with him, news from distant places, descriptions of cities Isabella had never seen. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a book, a ribbon, a piece of foreign fruit. Once, he brought her a tiny silver pendant. It was not expensive, but Isabella treasured it. She wore it beneath her dress. Her father noticed. "You still have it." "Always." "Good." He smiled. "It may remind you that you belong somewhere." Isabella did not understand why he said that. Years later, she would remember the words. The first letter. When Isabella was 11, the first letter arrived. It came from the royal court. The messenger had ridden through the night. That alone was enough to make the household nervous. Important letters rarely traveled quickly unless something important had happened. Her father broke the seal. He read the letter once. Then again. His expression changed. Isabella was sitting across the room with her embroidery. She noticed. "What is it?" Her father looked toward her mother. "Nothing." That was the first lie. Not a malicious one. A protective one. But Isabella recognized it. She had learned that adults often said nothing when something was very much happening. That evening, her parents spoke privately. Isabella was sent away, but the walls were thin. She heard fragments. The prince. alliance, border, necessary, too young, then silence. Isabella lay awake that night. She did not know what the words meant together, but she understood one thing. Her future was being discussed, and she was not in the room. The proposal. Several weeks later, her father finally told her. She was sitting beside the garden fountain. It was early spring. The trees were beginning to turn green. Her father sat beside her. Isabella. She looked up. There is something we must discuss. She waited. You have been asked to marry. She stared at him. Who? The king's son. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then, why? Her father sighed. Because your families are closely connected. But I don't know him. I know. Does he know me? Not really. That answer frightened her more than anything else. Her father continued. It is a political marriage. Isabella looked at the fountain. The water moved quietly. Do I have a choice? Her father did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. She looked at him. How old is he? 14. Isabella lowered her eyes. She was 12. The prince was 14. To the adults negotiating the marriage, the difference seemed manageable. To Isabella, it seemed enormous. She had never met him. She did not know whether he was kind. She did not know whether he laughed. She did not know what books he liked. She did not even know whether he was frightened of thunderstorms. Yet she was expected to marry him, the queen's messenger. The marriage was not merely about the two young people. The kingdom stood between rival powers. The prince's family controlled the northern territories. Isabella's family controlled important lands along the western border. A marriage would join them. It would make rebellion more difficult. It would strengthen the king. It would protect Isabella's family. And it would create a future heir. At 12, Isabella was already being discussed in terms of future children. This was one of the strangest realities of noble medieval life. People could speak about a child's future as if it were an item on a legal document. Nobody asked the child what she imagined. The adults believed they knew what was best. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they did not. And sometimes history remembered the consequences. Meeting the prince. The prince arrived in early summer. His name was Adrian. He rode into the courtyard with a small group of knights. He wore a dark blue cloak. He looked nervous. Isabella noticed immediately. That made her feel better. He was not arrogant. He was simply a boy who had also been told what his future would be. They were introduced in the great hall. Isabella curtsied. Adrian bowed. Neither spoke. Then Adrian said, "Your dress is very nice." Isabella almost laughed. She managed not to. "Thank you." Silence. He looked at the floor. She looked at the window. Finally, he said, "I don't know what I'm supposed to say." Isabella looked at him. "Neither do I." For the first time, he smiled. So did she. It was a very small beginning, but it mattered. The days before the wedding, the castle became increasingly busy. Cloth arrived from distant merchants. Jewelry was unpacked. Servants cleaned rooms. Priests prepared ceremonies. Cooks planned enormous meals. Messengers came and went. Isabella's mother supervised everything. The wedding was important, not romantic. Important. There is a difference. People from both families needed to see the ceremony. The political message had to be clear. The alliance was real. The two families were united. The future was secure. And so Isabella's wedding became a public event. Her private feelings were secondary. She understood that. But understanding something did not make it easier. The night before the wedding, her mother came to her room. Isabella was sitting by the window. Her wedding gown hung nearby. It was beautiful, too beautiful. The fabric was expensive. The embroidery was delicate. Gold thread caught the candlelight. Her mother stood behind her. "You are frightened." Isabella nodded. Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder. "You are allowed to be frightened." That surprised her. "Am I?" "Of course." "Then why does everyone behave as if I should be happy?" Her mother looked at the dress. "Because tomorrow must go well." Isabella turned. "What about me?" Her mother's expression softened. "You matter. Then why can't I choose?" The question stayed between them. Her mother had no good answer. Finally, she said, "Because sometimes people are born into responsibilities they did not choose." Isabella looked down. "Will I ever choose anything?" Her mother sat beside her. "I hope you will." It was not a promise, but it was the closest thing Isabella had. The morning of the wedding. The wedding morning began before sunrise. Isabella barely slept. When the first bell rang, servants entered her chamber. Water was brought. Her hair was washed. Her dress was prepared. Her hands were carefully cleaned. Her hair was braided. Jewelry was placed around her neck. The small silver pendant her father had given her was tucked beneath the wedding gown. She insisted on wearing it. Nobody objected. Outside, the castle was already awake. Horses moved in the courtyard. Guests arrived. Musicians prepared their instruments. Priests walked through the chapel. The smell of bread and roasted meat filled the air. The entire castle seemed to know that something important was happening. Only Isabella felt as though she were watching someone else's life. She stood before the mirror. For a moment, she barely recognized herself. She looked like a noble woman, not a child, not the girl who had run through the gardens, not the girl who had climbed the old tower stairs. A bride. At 12, she touched the silver pendant beneath her dress. Then she took a slow breath and opened the door. The ceremony. The chapel was filled with people. Nobles, knights, priests, family members, servants standing along the walls. Candles flickered before the altar. The air smelled of wax and incense. Adrian stood waiting. He looked just as nervous as she felt. When Isabella approached, he smiled. It was reassuring. The ceremony began. Words were spoken in Latin. Promises were made. Hands were joined. Prayers were offered. The marriage was formalized. And when it was finished, Isabella realized that the world had not changed. The stone walls were still there. The candles still burned. People were still whispering. Outside, a horse neighed. Somewhere in the castle kitchen, someone dropped a pan. Life continued, but Isabella's life had changed. She was now married. She was 12 years old, and she had entered. There are some moments in history that are remembered because armies marched. Others are remembered because kings died. And then there are moments that history records almost casually, even though, for the person living through them, they must have felt enormous. A girl wakes before sunrise. Someone tells her to dress. Someone else brushes her hair. A servant brings a gown that is too formal for an ordinary morning. Adults speak in low voices. Doors open and close. Candles burn. And slowly, the girl begins to understand that something has been decided about her life. She is 12 years old, and today, she is going to be married. Not because she has fallen in love, not because she has chosen someone, not because she has imagined a future with another person. She is being married because kingdoms need alliances, because families need protection, because land needs heirs, because kings and nobles have always found ways to turn private lives into political arrangements. Her name is Isabella, and by the end of this story, she will wear a crown. But tonight, we will not begin with the crown. We will begin with the girl. Because before she became a queen, Isabella was simply a child trying to understand why the adults around her had suddenly become so serious. So, for a while, let us leave the modern world behind. Imagine a medieval kingdom somewhere in Western Europe. The century is the late Middle Ages. Stone castles rise above green valleys. Church bells divide the hours. Horses carry messages between towns. Candles provide the light after sunset. Roads are muddy. Winters are long. And information travels slowly, except when it concerns gossip. Then, somehow, it travels remarkably well. Tonight the kingdom is quiet. A thin mist rests over the fields. Not power, not ambition, something quieter. Awareness. Isabella had started noticing the world around her. She watched how nobles behaved. She listened to how people spoke about the king. She noticed which servants were treated kindly and which were ignored. She began to understand that a palace was not simply a beautiful place. It was a machine made of people. And if she was going to survive inside it, she would have to learn how it worked. The forgotten child was gone. The young bride remained. And somewhere in the distant future, beyond wars, grief, politics, and years of waiting, a crown was already moving slowly toward her. But Isabella did not know that yet. Tonight, she only knew that tomorrow she would leave the castle where she had grown up. So let the candles burn low. Let the stone corridors become quiet. Let the horses rest in the stable. And let the young bride sleep for a few hours before the journey begins. Because the marriage was only the beginning. The real story would begin after she left home to a world from which there would be no easy return. The morning after the wedding did not feel like the beginning of a new life. It felt like an ordinary morning. That was perhaps the strangest part. The sun rose. The bells rang. Servants carried water through the corridors. Someone shouted instructions in the courtyard. Horses stamped their feet against the cold stone. Bread was baked. Breakfast was prepared. And beyond the castle walls, farmers were already beginning another day. The world had not changed. Only Isabella had. She was 12 years old, married, and preparing to leave the only home she had ever known. There would be no long period of adjustment, no quiet year in which she could slowly become accustomed to the idea. Her husband's family wanted her at the royal court. The journey had been arranged. The wagons were waiting, and before the morning was over, she would be on the road. She stood beside the window of her room and looked across the courtyard one last time. She knew every corner. The old well, the stable, the garden wall, the tower where she had once hidden during games. The small chapel where she had prayed with her mother. The tree beneath which her father had once taught her how to recognize different birds. All of it was still there, but she would not be. Not for a long time. Leaving home, her mother came to see her before departure. For several minutes, neither woman spoke. Isabella was the monastery. That night, the procession stopped at a monastery. The monks offered food and shelter. Isabella had visited monasteries before, but this one was larger than any she had seen. The walls were thick. The corridors were quiet. The library contained shelves of manuscripts. After dinner, Isabella asked permission to see the books. One of the monks led her into a small room. Candles burned along the walls. Books were stacked carefully. Some were chained to wooden desks. Isabella ran her fingers over the edge of one manuscript. "What do you read?" the monk asked. "History." "Why?" She thought about the question. "Because everyone here keeps telling me what I am supposed to become." The monk smiled. "And you would rather know what people became?" "Yes. That is a sensible curiosity." He handed her a manuscript. "History may teach you that people rarely become what they intended." Isabella looked at the pages. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" The monk laughed. "Not particularly." She smiled. That night, she read until her eyes became tired. She learned about queens who had ruled through difficult wars, women who had lost children, women who had negotiated treaties, women whose names had disappeared from memory, and one woman who had become queen unexpectedly after the death of her brothers. Isabella paused. She wondered what it felt like to wake one morning and discover that the entire kingdom suddenly depended on you. At 12, such a thought seemed impossible. The royal capital. After several days, they reached the capital. Isabella saw the city before she saw the palace. It was enormous. People filled the streets. Merchants called out. Carts moved slowly through muddy roads. Blacksmiths worked beside open workshops. Children ran between adults. Dogs searched for scraps. Church bells rang. The smell of bread mixed with smoke, leather, animals, and rain. Isabella had never seen so many people living together. The royal palace stood beyond the city walls. It was larger than her childhood home. Towers rose above the surrounding buildings. Banners hung from the walls. Guards stood at every entrance. The gates opened. The procession entered. And Isabella realized that she had crossed an invisible boundary. She was no longer simply the daughter of a duke. She was now part of the royal household. People would watch her. People would judge her. People would talk about her. And some people would eventually try to use her. She just did not know who they were yet. Her new household. Isabella was given several attendants. The most important was a woman named Agnes. She was in her 30s. Quiet, practical, and impossible to impress. Agnes had served at court for years. She knew every corridor, every important family, every dangerous rumor. She could identify a nobleman's mood from the way he closed a door. Isabella quickly liked her. On the first evening, Agnes helped Isabella unpack. You'll want to keep your personal things separate. Why? Because people borrow things. Without asking, especially without asking. Isabella looked at her. Agnes smiled. Welcome to court. Learning the palace. The first months were a strange education. Isabella learned that royal life was filled with rules nobody had written down. She learned where to stand during ceremonies, who should be greeted first, which nobles could be approached, which nobles should be allowed to approach her. She learned that people often smiled while delivering unpleasant news. She learned that a compliment could sometimes be a warning. She learned that silence in a council chamber could mean disagreement. And she learned that servants knew more than most nobles realized. Agnes taught her these things slowly. Never ask a servant whether something happened. Why? Ask what they saw. What is the difference? People can lie about what happened. They have a harder time lying about what they saw. Isabella remembered that. It became another lesson. Adrian's education. Adrian was rarely free. His days were filled with training, swordsmanship, horse riding, Latin, law, religion, military strategy, diplomacy. He studied from morning until evening. Sometimes Isabella saw him in the corridors. He looked exhausted. One evening, they met beside a courtyard fountain. "You look tired." "I am. Do you ever rest?" He laughed. "Princes do not rest." "That sounds unpleasant." "It is." She sat on the stone edge of the fountain. He joined her. For a while they watched the water. Then Adrian asked, "Do you miss home?" "Every day." "Me too." She looked at him. "You grew up here." "Yes." "But—" He hesitated. "I miss being ordinary." Isabella understood immediately. Neither of them was ordinary anymore. The Queen Mother. The Queen Mother, Eleanor of Artois, was one of the most powerful women at court. She was elegant, disciplined, and difficult to read. She had survived years of political struggles. She rarely raised her voice. She did not need to. When she entered a room, conversations became quieter. Isabella first met her formally. The Queen Mother examined her for a long moment. "You are younger than I expected." "Yes, Your Grace." "You are nervous." "Yes, Your Grace." "Good." Isabella had heard that answer before. It reminded her of another royal woman she had once met. The Queen Mother smiled. "You will learn." "Learn what?" "Everything." That was all she said. The first political lesson. A few weeks later, Isabella witnessed her first serious political dispute. Two noble families were arguing over a border. Each claimed the land. Each produced documents. Each had witnesses. Each insisted the other side was lying. The king listened. Adrian watched. Isabella sat behind the Queen Mother. She expected the king to decide immediately. He did not. Instead, he asked questions. Then more questions. Then he dismissed both sides. Isabella was confused. Later, she asked the Queen Mother why. The Queen Mother smiled. If the king had decided immediately, one family would have lost. Yes. And what would they have done? Been angry. They would have become enemies. So the king waited. Isabella thought about it. Waiting is sometimes a decision. Exactly. That lesson would become one of the most important of her life. The winter court. Winter arrived. The palace became darker. Fires burned constantly. People wore heavy clothing. Travel became difficult. The royal household remained inside for long periods. This was when Isabella began to see the palace differently. During summer, court seemed enormous. During winter, it became intimate. People ate together. They argued. They played games. They prayed. They told stories. They grew bored. And boredom could be dangerous. Because bored people talked. Isabella began hearing rumors. A duke was unhappy. A bishop wanted influence. A foreign ambassador had offered something. A lord had borrowed money. Someone's marriage was failing. Someone else's was being arranged. And beneath all of it was the question nobody spoke openly. Who would control the kingdom when the old king was gone? Adrian was the heir, but being heir did not mean being safe. The first threat. One evening, Isabella returned to her chamber and found that something was missing. Her silver pendant. She searched everywhere. Under the bed, inside her chest, among her clothing. Nothing. She called Agnes. Agnes immediately understood the seriousness. Who entered the room today? I don't know. Think. Isabella tried. A servant. A lady. 2 maids. A messenger. Agnes questioned them. Nobody admitted anything. Then, just before midnight, the pendant was found. It had been placed on Isabella's desk. Beside it was a small piece of parchment. 3 words were written on it. You are being watched. Isabella stared at the message. She felt cold. Agnes took it. Do not tell anyone. Why? Because we do not know who wrote it. Shouldn't the king know? Eventually, Agnes folded the parchment. But first we learn. The hidden conversation. The following day, Isabella began watching. Not obviously. She simply paid attention. Who looked at her? Who avoided her? Who asked questions about her? She noticed a particular court official. Lord Bernard. He was one of the king's advisors. He had never spoken directly to Isabella, yet he always seemed to know where she was. That frightened her. She mentioned it to Adrian. He became serious. Are you sure? No. Then we cannot accuse him. I know. Adrian looked around the corridor. Someone is worried about you. Why? He hesitated. Because you are my wife. Isabella looked at him. I am 12. That does not matter to them. He was right. In court politics, age mattered less than position. She was married to the future king. That made her valuable. And anything valuable could become a target. A small garden. To escape the palace, Isabella often visited a small, enclosed garden. It was not large. There were herbs, rose bushes, a fountain, several fruit trees. She liked it because nobody expected her to perform there. One afternoon, Adrian joined her. They walked slowly between the plants. He had received bad news. His father was ill. Very ill. How serious? I don't know. Will he recover? I hope. They continued walking. Then Adrian said, If something happens to my father. He stopped. Isabella waited. I will become king. She looked at him. Yes. And you? He did not finish. She understood. She would become queen. They stood silently beneath the trees. The possibility had always existed, but it had been distant, almost imaginary. Now it was approaching, slowly, quietly, like winter. The king's illness. The king's condition worsened. Physicians came. Priests prayed. Messages were sent. The court changed immediately. People became more careful. Visitors arrived more frequently. Some nobles suddenly wanted to spend time with Adrian. Others became distant. Isabella watched. She noticed who came, who did not, who brought gifts, who brought letters, who suddenly became very polite. The Queen Mother remained calm, but Isabella noticed that she slept very little. One night, Isabella found her alone in the chapel. "Your Grace." The Queen Mother turned. "Why are you awake? I could ask you the same." The Queen Mother smiled. "Come sit." They sat together beneath the candles. After a long silence, the Queen Mother spoke. "You are going to have a difficult life." Isabella swallowed. "I know." "No." The Queen Mother looked directly at her. "You don't." She reached for Isabella's hand. "You are young. That is not your fault." Isabella looked down. "But people will use your youth against you. What should I do?" "Learn." "Learn what?" "Everything." The Queen Mother smiled sadly. "That is what queens do." The crown approaches. The king died before spring. The bells rang across the capital. People gathered in the streets. Churches filled. The royal household went silent. Adrian became king, and Isabella became queen. She was still 12. For a moment, she stood alone inside her chamber after receiving the news. The crown had come, not as a celebration, not with music, not with joy. It came with grief. Her husband had lost his father. The kingdom had lost its ruler. And now 2 children were expected to carry the weight of an entire country. Isabella touched the silver pendant beneath her dress. She remembered her father. She remembered her mother. She remembered the girl who had once sat beside a garden fountain and asked whether she had any choice. Now she understood the answer. Perhaps she had not chosen the crown, but she could choose what kind of queen she would become. Outside, the bells continued ringing. The palace filled with footsteps. Messengers hurried through corridors. Nobles gathered. The council prepared, and Isabella stood quietly beside the window. The girl who had once been told to smile when frightened now understood something very clearly. The marriage had made her a princess, but grief had made her a queen, and the kingdom was waiting to discover what kind of queen she would be. The coronation was still ahead. The political battles were only beginning. The people who had whispered about her age would soon challenge her authority. And somewhere inside the palace, the person who had written those 3 words, "You are being watched," was still waiting. The crown had arrived, but peace had not. And before Isabella could truly become queen, she would have to survive the people who believed a 12-year-old girl had no place near the throne. For tonight, however, the palace could sleep. The candles could burn quietly. The guards could walk beneath the stars. And somewhere in the darkness, a very young queen was beginning to understand that a crown was not a reward. It was a responsibility. Tomorrow, the kingdom would begin asking her to prove that she deserved it. The morning after the king's death, the palace did not wake as it usually did. There were no cheerful voices in the courtyard, no musicians, no unnecessary conversation. Even the servants seemed to move more quietly. Black cloth appeared along the walls. Candles burned before the chapel. Messengers came and went through the gates. And everywhere Isabella looked, she saw people waiting for instructions, waiting for news, waiting to discover which way the kingdom would turn. She stood beside the window of her chamber, still wearing the simple night robe she had slept in. She was 12 years old, a queen. The word still felt strange. Queen. It seemed too large for her, too heavy, like a garment made for someone much older. But titles did not wait for people to grow into them. They arrived when history required them. And history was requiring Isabella now. The first morning as queen, Agnes entered carrying Isabella's clothing. The council wants you dressed. Isabella looked at her. For the funeral? For the council? The council? Agnes nodded. They want to see you. Why? Agnes paused. Because they want to know whether you are frightened. Isabella almost smiled. I am. Then don't show them. That was becoming a familiar lesson. Isabella dressed carefully. A dark gown. A modest necklace. The silver pendant hidden beneath the fabric. Her hair was braided simply. She looked young. There was no way around that. No dress could make 12 years old become 25. No crown could erase childhood. And yet when she entered the council chamber, every person in the room stood. That was the first time Isabella truly understood what a crown could do. It could make people stand even when they did not respect you. The council chamber. The king's council was filled with powerful men. Dukes, bishops, military commanders, advisors, representatives from important families. At the head of the table sat Adrian. He was 14. He looked pale. The death of his father had changed him overnight. The counselors bowed. Then they sat. Isabella remained beside Adrian. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Finally, Lord Bernard broke the silence. Your Majesties. He bowed. The kingdom needs stability. Adrian nodded. Of course. And stability requires experienced hands. Isabella looked at him. The words sounded harmless. They were not. Lord Bernard continued. His Majesty is young. He looked at Adrian. And Her Majesty is younger still. Nobody moved. Isabella felt her hands tighten beneath the table. There it was. The first challenge. Not an attack. Not yet. Something more subtle. A suggestion. The kingdom needed adults. The king and queen were children. Therefore, adults should rule for them. Isabella looked toward the queen mother. She remained completely still. Adrian seemed uncertain. Then Isabella remembered her mother's lesson. Never answer every question immediately. So she said nothing, and that silence made Lord Bernard uncomfortable. The regent. A proposal was placed before the council. A regent would govern in Adrian's name. Officially, it was meant to protect the kingdom. In practice, it would give one powerful person enormous authority. Several nobles supported the idea. Others opposed it. The room became divided. Adrian looked toward Isabella. She did not speak. Later, in private, he asked her why. "You wanted to say something." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" "Because they were waiting for me to speak." "Isn't that what they wanted?" "Exactly." Adrian frowned. "I don't understand. If I had spoken angrily, they would have called me childish." He stared at her. "If I had agreed, they would have called me weak." "So what did you do?" "Nothing." He smiled faintly. "That sounds like you." Isabella laughed. Sometimes nothing is useful. But she knew the truth. Silence could only protect her for so long. Eventually, she would have to speak. The first test. 3 days later, a dispute arrived from the western border. A group of nobles had refused to pay a royal tax. They claimed the new king had no authority to demand it. The council wanted troops sent immediately. Adrian was inclined to agree. Isabella asked to see the letter. She read it twice. Then she noticed something. The letter mentioned the tax had been collected before the king's death. That meant the dispute was not really about the tax. It was about the new king. Someone was testing him. Isabella looked at Adrian. "Do not send soldiers." The council chamber became quiet. Lord Bernard frowned. "Your Majesty? The tax is not the problem." "What is?" "They want to know whether the king will react." Adrian looked at her. "And if I do, they will know they can provoke you." Lord Bernard shook his head. "A rebellion must be answered with strength." Isabella looked at him. "Sometimes." Then she returned to the letter. "But strength does not always mean soldiers." The room became still. Adrian finally spoke. "Send a messenger." Lord Bernard objected. But the king had decided. The messenger went. 3 days later, the nobles withdrew their protest. There had been no rebellion, only a test, and Isabella had passed hers. The queen's reputation. News traveled quickly, not officially, through servants, merchants, knights, priests. People began talking about the young queen. Some called her clever. Others called her manipulative. Some said she was too quiet. Others said she was dangerous because she listened too carefully. The truth was simpler. Isabella was learning. Every day, she learned names. She learned family connections. She learned which nobles had old grievances. She learned which bishops supported which families. She learned which military commanders were loyal to the crown. And she learned that a kingdom was not ruled only from a throne. It was ruled through relationships. A promise made years earlier could matter more than a royal command. A friendship could prevent a war. An insult could create one. A marriage could secure a border. A rumor could destroy a reputation. Isabella began to understand the invisible structure beneath the visible kingdom. The letter from home. One afternoon, a letter arrived from her mother. Isabella recognized the handwriting immediately. She opened it alone. Her mother asked about the palace, about Adrian, about the Queen Mother, about whether Isabella was eating properly. The questions were ordinary. That made Isabella emotional. She read the letter twice. Then she wrote back. She described the palace, the gardens, the council, the strange rules. She did not mention how frightened she was. She did not mention Lord Bernard. She did not mention the pressure. She did not want her mother to worry. But at the end of the letter, she wrote one sentence. "I wish I could come home." She stared at the words. Then she crossed them out. She replaced them with, "I miss you very much." That was safer. The young king. Adrian was changing too. The death of his father had forced him to grow quickly. He began attending more meetings. He studied military reports. He listened to ambassadors. He asked questions. Sometimes he made mistakes. Isabella did too. They were still children. But they were children surrounded by people who expected them to behave like rulers. One evening, Adrian returned from a difficult council meeting. He threw his gloves onto a table. "I hate this." Isabella looked up from her book. "What happened?" They argued for 2 hours. About money. Of course. He laughed. Then he sat beside her. "Sometimes I wish we could leave." "Where would we go?" "I don't know. Somewhere with no councils. Somewhere with no bishops. No ambassadors. No nobles. No crowns." Isabella smiled. "It sounds wonderful." They sat quietly. For a few minutes, they were not king and queen. They were simply two young people imagining a place where nobody expected anything from them. The coronation. The coronation was held in early summer. The capital filled with visitors. Banners hung from towers. Church bells rang. Crowds gathered in the streets. The ceremony was magnificent, but Isabella felt strangely detached from it. She walked beneath arches. She heard prayers. She felt the weight of the crown when it was placed upon her head. She heard the words declaring her queen. The crowd applauded, and for one brief moment, she looked toward the back of the cathedral. There stood Agnes, smiling. Isabella smiled back. That small exchange meant more to her than the ceremony, because Agnes had known her before the crown, before the marriage, before the palace, before anyone called her queen. Agnes remembered the girl. And perhaps that was what Isabella needed most. Someone who remembered. The woman behind the crown. After the coronation, Isabella returned to her chamber. She removed the crown. It was heavier than she expected. She placed it on the table. Then she sat down. For several minutes, she simply stared at it. Agnes entered. Beautiful. It is heavy. Most important things are. Isabella touched the crown. Do you think I can do this? Agnes did not answer immediately. Then she said, You already are. Isabella looked at her. You've been learning since you were a little girl. Learning what? How to watch. Agnes smiled. Now you must learn how to decide. That was the next stage. Watching was no longer enough. The queen would have to act. Lord Bernard's move. Lord Bernard had not forgotten his defeat. He had expected the young king and queen to depend upon him. Instead, Isabella had slowly begun building her own network. That worried him. He began approaching other nobles. Quiet conversations, private dinners, letters, promises. He did not openly oppose the queen. He did something more effective. He encouraged people to doubt her. She is too young. She is too ambitious. She is too influenced by foreign advisors. She is controlling the king. None of these accusations needed to be true. They only needed to be repeated. Isabella began hearing them. At first, she wanted to fight them. Then she remembered the lesson of the council. Do not react simply because someone wants you to react. So she waited and watched. The messenger from the north. One autumn morning, a messenger arrived from the northern border. He carried terrible news. A neighboring lord had gathered soldiers. The kingdom was facing a potential invasion. The council demanded immediate action. This time, Isabella agreed. The army had to prepare. But she asked another question. Why now? Nobody knew. She looked at the map. The northern lord was not powerful enough to defeat the kingdom alone. Then she noticed something. His territory bordered the lands of one of Lord Bernard's allies. Isabella understood. This was not simply an invasion. It was a political test. Perhaps someone inside the kingdom was helping the enemy. The possibility frightened her. Because if she was right, the danger was not outside the walls. It was already inside. The secret meeting. That night, Isabella met Adrian privately. She showed him the map. If Bernard is involved, we cannot accuse him without proof. What do we do? Watch. Adrian sighed. Again. Yes. They agreed to send trusted messengers. They would follow the movement of letters. They would observe who communicated with the northern lord. And they would wait. Weeks passed. Nothing happened. Then, one evening, a servant brought Isabella a sealed message. It contained a list of names. One name appeared 3 times. Lord Bernard. Isabella read it slowly. Her heart beat faster. She had suspected him. Now she had something close to proof. But she still needed more. Because removing a powerful noble without certainty could create the very rebellion she was trying to prevent. The young queen understood something important. Power was not simply the ability to punish your enemies. Sometimes power was the ability to wait until you could prove they were your enemies. The quiet before the storm. Winter returned. Snow covered the capital. The palace grew quiet again. Isabella spent long evenings reading. Adrian trained. The council met. The northern border remained tense. Lord Bernard continued smiling. Nobody outside a small circle knew how serious the situation had become. Isabella was no longer merely learning to be queen. She was beginning to understand the price of being one. She had been married at 12, crowned at 12, and now, still barely more than a child, she was being asked to protect a kingdom from men twice her age. There were nights when she cried, quietly, usually after everyone had gone to sleep. She never cried in council, never before ambassadors, never before the nobles, but alone. Sometimes she allowed herself to remember the girl she had been, the girl who had wanted to go home, the girl who had wondered whether she would ever choose anything. She had not chosen the crown. She had not chosen the marriage. But now she was beginning to choose what she would do with both. And that choice would soon bring her face to face with the most dangerous man in the kingdom. Lord Bernard had been watching her. She had been watching him. Neither knew exactly how far the other was prepared to go. But the first move had already been made. And when spring returned, the quiet palace would no longer be quiet. For tonight, however, the snow continued to fall. The torches flickered along the walls. Adrian slept in his chambers. Isabella sat beside a candle with the silver pendant resting against her skin. She thought of her mother. She thought of her father. She thought of the little girl who had once sat beside a garden fountain and asked whether she had any choice. Perhaps the answer was finally becoming clear. She could not choose how her story had begun, but she could choose how it continued. And somewhere beyond the frozen walls, the first signs of a greater crisis were already gathering. The young queen had survived her wedding. She had survived the court. She had survived the coronation. Now she would have to survive politics. And the most difficult part of her reign had not yet begun.